Good evening, everyone, and a very, very warm welcome to the Margaret Fell Lecture Theatre here on the Balerig campus at Lancaster University. My name is Wendy Robinson, and I'm the university's Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Education, and I'm delighted to be hosting this evening's public lecture and to welcome everyone here to the event. Now, whether this is your first public lecture or we've seen you before, which we may well have done, we're very, very pleased to welcome you to a Lancaster University public lecture. These events, we think, are really important because they're an important part of our engagement programme for our local community and our regional community. We aim to host lectures that are meaningful and that are relevant, that are current, and that above all are interesting for those that are attending. This evening, we're absolutely thrilled to welcome Professor Rachel Muers, who joined the University of Edinburgh in 2022 as the first woman to hold the historic Chair of Divinity. Rachel has previously held posts at the University of Exeter and the University of Leeds. And Rachel's main research interests are at the intersections between modern Christian theology and ethics. For this evening's lecture, which we think is most appropriately located in this Margaret Fell Lecture Theatre, we're really pleased that Rachel is going to introduce us to and tell us more about Margaret Fell, who was known for her influential early statements of Quaker principles and for her arguments in defence of women's leadership and women's preaching. Margaret Fell was imprisoned for several years in Lancaster for refusing to take the oath of allegiance and for allowing Quaker meetings to take place in her home for worship. In Rachel's talk, she will draw on Margaret Fell's life and work to explore themes of religious authority and leadership, power and protest, freedom of conscience, and how her life and thought is still really important for us today. At the end of Rachel's talk, there will be some time for questions from the audience, and it's a great honour to have Rachel with us here tonight. So without much further delay, we'll get on to the serious business of the evening and invite Rachel to come and give us her talk. So welcome, Rachel.
Well, I'm really honoured to have been asked to give this lecture and to have been welcomed so warmly, and I'm really grateful to all of you who've made the time to be here. Now, I know for a fact, because I know some of the folks in this room, that there are people in this room who have been thinking about Margaret Fell for more years than I have. I also expect, or I'm assuming, kind of almost hoping, that there are some people in the room who know her only as the name of a lecture theatre. So I'm going to apologise in advance for anything that either group finds lacking, and I'm hoping that there's going to be something in it for everybody. I'm going to start by giving you the too long didn't listen version of who Margaret Fell was, in the hope that it will persuade you to listen to the rest, though we've heard a little bit of an introduction to start with. So Margaret Fell was a religious leader, political activist and organiser, born more than 400 years ago, based for much of her life in the South Lakes, then part of Lancashire, now in Cumbria, Ulverston area. You've got a picture here. She was a witness of and active participant in one of the most turbulent periods of English religious and political history. She was a highly educated woman who was a very prolific writer and an original religious thinker, who spoke into many of the big controversies of her day. She had two very different, very unusual and very successful marriages and raised 8 children. And I get to the list of that and think, goodness, I'm underachieving it. She was also, as you've heard, a convict. She spent more than 4 years in prison for what you might now describe as membership of a prescribed organisation. The main reason we're still talking about her now as has been alluded to already, is because the organisation or movement of which she was one of the most influential members of the founding generation survived as the Religious Society of Friends Quakers. Now, I know there's the folk in the audience who are very familiar with Quakers from the inside or as students of Quaker history. I am still hoping to persuade you that Margaret Fell would be worth talking about anyway, even without many generations of Quakers after her. Because speaking in a university context and in her very own lecture theatre, I hope that I can use Margaret Fell and her life and work to encourage us to think about a few wider questions that seem to me to be essential and urgent for all of us now, and especially essential in a university. So these are some of the challenges that the stories and Margaret's life and work put to me. Where do we find new vision, hope, or community when things fall apart? How do exciting ideas or creative interpretations of text become real changes in society? What matters to you enough, or what are you sure about enough, that you would go to prison for it? And then just as a bonus question, why are there still so many places of power, both in religion and in politics, where women can be as clever and as well-informed and as confident as you like and still not be listened to on anything like equal terms? Why are there still questions about women's authority to speak in public? So these are, I suppose, some of the questions that I feel like in my job, in my life as a university lecturer, I'm trying to get students to think about anyway, and they're some of the questions that I think Margaret Fell makes you think about, which is why I like that she has her own lecture theatre. The history over here in the lecture, I'm going to warn you, those of you who've studied this period of history will spot all the bits where I'm oversimplifying, and you can challenge me on it later and fill in the gaps. I really love to have that conversation. I need to start with a very brief biographical overview of a woman who, just to make things complicated, was known at different times in her life by 3 different names. She was born Margaret Askew, 1614, and died Margaret Fox, 1702. So 1614, 1702, knowing the dates, that already tells you that she lived through the English Civil War, the execution of Charles I, Cromwell's protectorate, the restoration of the monarchy, and towards the end of her life, the abdication of King James II and the Glorious Revolution, quote unquote. And that's just a few of the political upheavals just in England, which is why I've given you this nice little montage of all of the rulers of England during Margaret Fell's life. It's quite a long life, but we're talking a period when there's a lot going on. And we'll get to how some of those upheavals, some of the specific ones, made a difference to Margaret a little bit later. That's the wrong slide. I'll just go back. So Margaret was brought up in a relatively wealthy family in the South Lakes, educated quite well, as I said, as was common for girls of her class, and married at a young age of 17 or 18, different things in different texts, to Thomas Fell. And he's in the next picture. Finally, the next slide. Great. Thomas Fell, he's more than 10 years older than her. That wasn't the unusual bit about the marriage. His home, and thus Margaret's home, as it turned out for basically the rest of her life, some complexities there, was Swarthmore Hall near Ulverston. The picture you've got here makes it look, I realise it makes it look like a little cottage. It's not, we're talking a substantial house, or a hall. So within 10 years of their marriage, Margaret's marriage to Thomas Fell, the English Civil War was underway. Thomas Fell, he's a very able, he's a big man in the area. He's a lawyer, he becomes a Justice of the Peace, he becomes a Member of Parliament. He's a big supporter of the parliamentary cause, a Puritan, rises to high office during and after the Civil War, later resigns his post on a matter of conscience, which is an interesting thing. Possibly most important for understanding Margaret's life, about the most important thing about her husband here is that first his reputation and character, and then also quite fast Margaret's own, brought a steady stream of guests to their home. So we're talking about a house that is a centre of hospitality and welcome and conversation for what she, when she writes about her life, she later describes it this way. She says, people who came were many of those that were accounted the most serious and godly men. People with serious questions about the state of the nation or the state of people's souls or both. And Margaret, by all accounts, Margaret is the person who makes the conversation space, the welcome space for the people who want to ask these questions. She's the one who makes it work, because much of the time she's left in charge. Her husband's travelling for work, effectively. It's her space, it's her home. And it seems she's not just holding a space, she was herself deeply exercised by religious questions. As she later put it in her autobiographical text, she was inquiring and seeking. The moment when Margaret Fell really enters the bigger story of the developing and complex religious and political life in England, it's in 1652, the period of the Commonwealth, when a travelling preacher called George Fox, fresh from holding an enormous outdoor meeting nearby on Furbank Fell, turns up in Ulverston. He visits Swarthmore Hall, he speaks in the church, and as Margaret wrote about this much later, this visit was the occasion of a profound conversion experience for her. When Quakers tell sort of standard, if you like, almost hagiographical history, the sort of dead simple history of how he came to be, you pinpoint 1652 and this encounter as the moment when it all gets going. It's much more complicated than that. We can say a little bit more about that later, but there's still something. There is still something happening here, which is the beginning of what is now Quakerism, which for the next few years was an extraordinarily rapid and successful movement of religious change. So this is the point at the beginning of what we might call a mission, a series of dramatic conversions. And the context of it is, before we come to the text that's on the board, it's worth saying sort of something about the moment. As many of you might know, the most famous historian of this period, Christopher Hill, calls this period the period of the world turned upside down. Right? You execute the king. Anything can happen. Right? At this point, the structures of authority are political and religious, which are intimately interwoven at this point, are all called into question. So we're in a context that's conditioned to expect the unexpected, and we've got a lot of people who, like Margaret, are trying to figure out what can be a basis for finding truth, finding community, finding assurance of oneself in the world and oneself before God, in a context in which everything's, all the sort of standard sources of such assurance have been taken away. So if we look at the narrative that I've given you here of Fell's conversion experience, which she also described in the more typically Quaker and biblical language of convincement. It's in Ulverston Steeplehouse, right, in Ulverston Church. George Fox, who went to Ulverston Steeplehouse, Margaret and family are already there. And when they'd done singing, he desired that he might have liberty to speak. He went on and opened the scriptures and said, the scriptures, the Bible, were the prophets' words and Christ's and the apostles' words, and what, as they spoke, they enjoyed and possessed and had it from the Lord, and said, then what had any to do with the scriptures, but as they came to the Spirit that gave them forth? You will say, Christ saith this, and the apostles say this, but what canst thou say? Art thou a child of the light, and hast walked in the light, and what thou speakest, is it inwardly from God? And then Margaret, this is what she says she heard. She's writing this down years later, so it's how she remembers it. Then she writes, this opened me so that it cut me to the heart, and then I saw clearly we were all wrong. And I cried in my spirit to the Lord, we are all thieves, we are all thieves. We've taken the scriptures in words and know nothing of them in ourselves. I saw that it was the truth, and I could not deny it, and I did as the apostle saith, I received the truth in the love of it. Now, There's a huge amount going on there, and I'm going to resist the temptation to spend the whole time talking about this one narrative, because you can kind of get a hold of Quaker theology out of this one bit. Here's what I want to pick up on, I think, for this place, this audience. It seems to me that what changes here, what she's utterly convinced of, this, you know, I saw that it was the truth and I could not deny it, this kind of conviction, is not some kind of new fact about the world or about God or about herself. There's this sort of say, well, actually, kind of have all the basic stuff. It's all written down, right? You know, how you're meant to be, how you're meant to orient yourself to the world, how you're meant to act. That's all there. But rather, what she's convinced of is the present personal application of the content of the text. That this actually means you. Yeah. And this is the key bit. This is actually the most important bit for what comes next. This sort of authority that personal application gives for speech and action, the idea that one can know and understand truth, religious truth, ultimate truth, truth about the truth that matters most about yourself, God, and the world. You can know that with a kind of conviction that enables and almost forces you to speak and to act on it. Because the kind of amazing thing about this, reading this experience in the context of her life and the context of what she does next, is that she clearly doesn't hear this sort of what canst thou say as just as a way of shutting somebody up. She took it as an invitation to what was possible. Speak up. What canst thou say? Not an invitation to, it's not just an invitation to like, say or speak whatever you feel like, give your own opinions, but it is certainly an invitation to seek truth and live in truth with a promise that you can find it. And that if you find it, you have to act on it. That's the thought. What Fox, so this is one example of him. We've got examples, plenty of examples in his own words of the sorts of things he said. This is a report. It's basically right. But what he and actually also various other preachers who joined him before this point, both men and women from the start, what they were advocating turned out in practice to be fairly radical. Most notably in terms of the practice of worship, the abandonment of set forms of worship or liturgy in favour of meetings that began with waiting on God, with silence in some way, and in which preaching or prophetic speech was spontaneous, as moved by the Spirit. And again, that preaching and prophetic speech being kind of anyone who's there. That seems to be pretty key from the start. We can talk, I'll say a little bit more later about the importance of women's involvement there. But also, so there's the sort of worship stuff, but also what becomes extremely important for Margaret's story from really early on, you've got some very socially disturbing moves, a very pointed disregard for social hierarchies, and the refusal to swear oaths, which becomes a big deal. And the point is, although this experience was framed as a new relationship to the truth that one's always accepted, that is just written in the Bible, it was associated already by 1652 with people who really kind of shook things up with some pretty odd and disruptive and disturbing behaviours. Which is why when at this visit of George Fox to Swarthmore Hall, when Margaret and her adult children appeared to be as kind of carried away with new religious fervour as the crowds at Furbank Fell, some of Thomas Fell's friends, some of their husband's friends, thought it was necessary to warn him and to hurry home and save his wife from being bewitched. And the thing is that it's one among many testaments to the mutual respect in their marriage that Thomas Fell came home and decided that although this new way of doing religion wasn't for him, it was clearly what his wife was going to do, and that was fine. He would support her. And that begins when Margaret becomes a rather kind of crucial part of a developing religious history. Because from this point, Swarthmore Hall, her home, becomes the base for the Quaker missionary movement. It's the centre from which travelling preachers go out, and to which they write their reports, their letters back, and from which they receive encouragement and advice. It's where they come back to meet and catch up on the news. And Margaret Fell is basically making all that happen. She is organising, advising, encouraging, keeping track, filing all the correspondence, writing it out again. One of the early Quaker preachers later wrote that her heart and home were open to this strange new collection of people from all over, different classes as well, increasingly all over the country. Her heart and home were open. I mean, I like that, but it does kind of leave out the considerable brain work that it took. This is my thought about making ideas change the world. So it's a little digression for academics in the room, because theologians like me, and maybe some other sorts of academics, do tend to underrate this kind of thing, right? Because we sometimes write and act as if ideas just like propagate themselves and change the world by magic, like because you've written a book, obviously now everybody thinks and acts differently. But those of us, just by force of being right, like if you're right, that's all you need to be, right? But then those of us who are actually also involved in any kind of political campaigning or any kind of non-profit organisation know really just how small is the ratio in terms of the brain power and skills required of big important ideas versus figuring out how many leaflets we need and who's going to book the room and bring the refreshments. And yeah, okay. So when I see in the Wikipedia article on Margaret Fell, which you can see if you look it up later, other online encyclopedias are available, that she became the secretary of the Quaker movement, we see that way of describing it. I first whistle, and I think that's really putting her down in terms of intellect and status. And then I think actually maybe that's a more realistic account of where the power lies in organisations. And after all, nobody's looking down on the Secretary General of the United Nations. Yeah. But in any case, during this period, Margaret's writing in her own name a huge range of what are called general epistles, so letters of advice and encouragement and theological exposition that go out to the new movement, right? Everybody who shows up gets one. She's exercising considerable power as a voice of internal controversies in a developing religious movement. And alongside George Fox and these early leaders, she's starting the process. It develops much more later on, but you're already starting to build up what is going to become a sustainable national organisation. So that, 50 years later at her death, and for that matter more than 350 years later, Quakers can keep going. Which is all the more remarkable because she and the early Quakers thought, not without reason, that the end of the world might show up fairly soon. So the fact that they managed to build something which kept going for 350 years is something to think about, right? At this point also, 1650s, Margaret's voice starts to be heard on the public stage. She's writing letters intended for wider publication, because this is basically, at this point, letters are open letters, or at least letters to important people are open letters, to Oliver Cromwell and to other officials, regional officials, local officials, in defence of Quakers, both the ideas and the people, as they're subject to sporadic and widespread persecution and ill treatment. They tend to show up in places, start preaching in public, and then somebody decides this is too disruptive, hauls them into prison. Quaker women preachers are subject to tend to get particularly a bad treatment because there's something about how a woman speaking in public is already a disruptive thing. So anyway, and so she's writing open letters. She's finding out about this. At this point, she's not there herself, right? But at this point, she's finding out about this, and she's writing all these very detailed letters, which basically end up being a chronicle of all the stuff that's gone wrong. Of the various official and semi-official mistreatment suffered by Quakers. I found I spotted the letter of 1653 already, so we're kind of only a year after things really get going, that, quote unquote, most part of the jails in the north part of England have some Quakers in them, as York, Carlisle, Appleby and Lancaster. And she had a position and influence and space that she could use to advocate for them because she's relatively wealthy. She's married to a well-known politician, effectively a well-known local politician. She's got ability to write well, connections and a known name. She's setting out the fact. She's arguing from the law. She's arguing from the Bible. And crucially, she's addressing her correspondence personally. It probably helps that, at least in the days of the Commonwealth, she knew some of them personally. But I've noticed in her letters, actually, that she sort of she takes a similar tone whoever she's writing to, including in due course when she's writing to the king, when the king comes back. Because she believes that people she's writing to, including General so-and-so in whose district lots of people who are preaching in public have been thrown in prison and have been treated badly, so somebody who looks like an enemy is clearly an opponent. She believes that they can be convinced of truth. She believes she's telling them what they need to know. She's calling them out, you'd say now, it basically is calling out, but she's doing so in the mode of a warning. And that's kind of a warning from a position of no power, so a warning about foreseeable consequences. What often gets called today speaking truth to power, saying, you carry on doing this. I'm just saying there's going to be a problem. I'm not in a position to cause a problem for you, but this is going to cause problems. As she puts it in one of her more negative letters from this period, which I'm quoting because it's a letter to all the professors of the world. It's great, study early Quaker stuff. Professor is almost always a negative term. It's people who profess Christianity, right, who claim to be Christians, the professors of the world. She says, writes to all the professors, to the light in all your consciences, to this in you all do I appeal, that with it you may search. You all have a conscience, you can all find truth, you can all see what's the right thing to do. You need to look for it. And all I can do is appeal to you. All I can do is appeal to you to look to it. She's also appearing at this time. I'm giving you I feel like I'm giving you lots of bits and pieces, and you can look them up, we can talk about them later. She starts to speak on major public issues, actually quite a surprising one to start with. Because one of the big controversies of Cromwell's rule was whether and on what terms Jewish people should be openly readmitted to England, having had no official presence since the 13th century. And Fell has strong views on this, and like many on the radical religious fringes, she's a very firm supporter of Jewish presence in England. She's a very firm supporter of the Jews should come back. And she wrote two short publications in the 1650s that were actually translated into Hebrew further down the line. And they're best described, they're in this context of the public debate about, is it okay to have Jews living in England? This was one of the things folk were debating. And she's writing basically invitations to the Jewish communities of Europe to come to England. Now, she's not a modern liberal, she wants them to convert to this radically deformalized Christianity that she's adopted. But then she kind of wanted to persuade everyone of that. So it's addressing on equal terms, right? Folks who are adherents of the established church, folks who are Baptists or whatever, folks who are Jews, she's appealing to everybody on the same terms. And she's taking a stand, a very clear stand, against those who were arguing, and there were quite a lot of people arguing this, that the very presence of Jewish people in England would put the identity of this godly nation, this Christian nation, in danger. That was a real voice in the space, and that's what she's speaking against. And there is, at least I see it, quite a direct line from this fundamental belief, and Margaret thought that everyone could come to know the truth about God for themselves. There's this text that she emphasizes a few times in her writings, that God is no respecter of persons. So she's got that idea that everyone can come to know the truth about God for themselves. So from that to the idea of addressing as friends and in some sense spiritual equals, people with whom you might otherwise think you had little in common. So I hope I've set Margaret up for you at this point as a leader and a writer and a thinker, and as a public voice and as a movement builder. And that's the 1650s, right? So there's a period when this has happened, and then her world turns upside down again. So two things happen 2 years apart. Her husband, Thomas Fell, who's been all this time been quite a powerful behind-the-scenes supporter of her and her associates. And questions about how much influence he is, but it didn't hurt them at all to have him on their side. He dies, 1658. And 2 years later, the monarchy is restored. King Charles II comes in. And at that point, there's an immediate risk, very visible risk of much more organized state suppression of anything that looks religiously or politically disruptive. We're trying to re-establish the monarchy. We're trying to re-establish, along with it, the church. And one of Margaret's most influential writings, which I've given you the front page of here, dates from this moment when the king comes back. Because she's not stupid, she sees the problem. She sees that this kind of situation in the Commonwealth in which there's localized issues for Quakers because they are seen to cause problems and disruption, but There's also quite a lot of toleration in the space from time to time. There's an immediate risk that the suppression of Quakers gets much more organised. So she gets on the front foot. She travels to London to deliver in person a statement to the brand new king about who Quakers are and why he should leave them free to do their thing and to practice this, no doubt to him, very strange form of religion. This is the declaration and information from us, the people of God, called Quakers. They weren't trying to make Googleable titles back then, so the title of every pamphlet is like, it's like the whole thing, the abstract is the title. Anyway, it's written by Margaret Fell. It was also signed by several male Quaker leaders, but it's her text. And it's, among other things, and one of the reasons that we kind of use it a lot now is that it's the first public statement that identifies Quakers collectively as what they basically remain from then on, a group collectively committed to non-violence. So Margaret writes in this, we are a people that follow after those things that make for peace, love, and unity. It is our desire that others' feet may walk in the same, and we do bear our testimony against all strifes and wars and contentions that come from the lusts that war in the members, that war in the soul. So there's a kind of collective sense of, a commitment to not fighting, basically, but also the sense that the war, civil or international, comes from the lust that war in the members. It's a spiritual problem. Right? Violence is a spiritual problem. It's identifying violence as a spiritual problem. What she's mainly doing in this text is not saying, oh, by the way, we're all going to be non-violent. She's saying, can we please have freedom of worship for Quakers and freedom from the imposition of a state church? She's asking politely, but she's certainly not begging. She says in this text, we desire and also expect to have the liberty of our consciences and just rights. And the liberty we do desire is that we may keep our consciences clear and void of offence towards God and towards men. So there's this sense which she knows her English law pretty well as well, and this is a developed way that quite a lot of the Quakers speak. There's a sense that we have rights and we're going to ask for them, appeal for them, but we're not going to fight to defend them, so we have to just appeal to you. Unfortunately, efforts to persuade the new regime that Quakers aren't a threat don't succeed for very long. So for several years in the 1660s, Margaret Fell was, as I said, a member of a proscribed organisation, actually a leader of a proscribed organisation that was specifically banned in English law. I refer you to the Quaker Act of 1662, which talks about certain persons under the names of Quakers and other names of separation who have taken up and maintained sundry dangerous opinions and tenets. And amongst others, their dangerous opinions include that the taking of an oath in any case whatsoever is unlawful, and the other thing that they're doing, according to the Act, the said persons under a pretence of religious worship do often assemble themselves in great numbers in several parts of this realm, to the great endangering of the public peace and safety and to the terror of the people, by maintaining a secret and strict correspondence amongst themselves, and in the meantime separating and dividing themselves from the rest of His Majesty's good and loyal subjects, and from the public congregations and usual places of divine worship. So basically, people meeting in large numbers in a way that claims to be religious, but isn't officially authorised, and isn't officially controlled or shaped in any way, is very, very dangerous and is specifically banned by the Quaker Act of 1662. And it actually prescribes substantial fines, imprisonment, possibility of transportation. It's one of a large collection, which many of you will know about, of laws restricting non-conformist religion. That's kind of by definition, this is just one of the ones that ends up getting used against Quakers. And so I think, I didn't know how much to put in about this, but I think to understand what Margaret does next, you need to understand a little bit about this whole thing about swearing oaths, because we've heard that she gets put in prison for refusing to swear an oath, and you might be sitting there thinking, well, why, and what's the big deal? Quakers don't I say don't because this would still be the case, right? They won't swear the kind of oath that's put you in the court, you hand on the Bible, swear to tell the truth. And they also won't swear an oath of allegiance or loyalty to a government. And they weren't the first Christian group to take that position. Jesus said, Sermon on the Mount, swear not at all. So you've got it written straight down there, and the Quakers weren't the first people to notice that. And sometimes when Margaret and others write about not being able to swear an oath, they just refer to that command and say, well, we're just doing as we're told. But sometimes she also talks, which I found quite interesting, about why oaths are bad, which is kind of the same reason why the government had a problem with people not swearing them. Because the way that these were working politically, really since Henry VIII in England, is the oath is a way of making you take sides, especially the oath of allegiance. It's a way of making you take sides. It's a way of signing your judgment, if you like, your judgment about a right and wrong over to somebody else. So they can rely on you to do what they say, but thereby effectively you've handed over your conscience to them. That's the claim. And having come through this extended period of political turmoil, when oaths were being used to and fro to assemble armies and then to establish and take down authority, and the literature in this period is full of people sort of saying, well, I took the oath to this person, but now I'm allowed to break it and say the oath to this person instead. And the oaths were kind of being used to set up the sides and to set up the power blocks. And the Quakers are just saying, we're opting out of that whole system. And it was enormously disturbing. To the authorities, because this was the means of establishing certain kinds of state power. And the point about swearing an oath is that you're basically making somebody tell God to punish them if they break the oath, if they do the wrong thing. So you're kind of weaponizing the conscience. Right? It means that then you don't have to enforce their compliance because you've made them scared to break compliance. That's the kind of logic of the oath, and that's what the Quakers are saying. We don't buy into that. And it's because Quaker Act, related laws, penal laws, which collectively affected many groups besides Quakers, that Margaret Fell found herself before the Justices of the Peace in Ulverston in 1664. And I always wonder, reading this, how it felt for a judge's widow to be on the other side of the law. She's hauled up basically because she's holding unauthorised meetings in her house. She's holding Swarthmore Hall has continued to be the place where people meet for worship. They've continued to show up. It sounds, when you read about how that trial went down, that they would really have preferred to avoid the embarrassment of sending this local personage, this lady of the whatever, to prison. So they offered not to put her on the spot, not to ask her to swear an oath, if she would promise to stop holding meetings for worship in her house. And so they're kind of, well, if we actually say to you, please swear an oath, and you refuse, we'll have to send you to prison. But, can we just say, we won't do that if you promise to stop holding meetings for worship? As she later recalled it, she said, while it pleased the Lord to let me have a house, I would endeavour to worship him in it. And so they asked her to swear the oath of allegiance. She said no, and she was sent off to prison in Lancaster. Now, she's actually being convicted under a much older law at this point, which was being used against Quakers a lot, which basically prescribed very severe penalties to anybody who'd refuse an oath of allegiance to the monarch, because technically she was sentenced at this point to indefinite imprisonment. In fact, she was released after about 4 years in one of the periods of relative toleration in between persecutions, because she had a lot of people advocating for her. Quakers had a lot of people advocating for them. But so this is the period when she's in prison in Lancaster. One of her stronger connections to Lancaster is it imprisoned her. But there you go. And her most famous piece of writing, which we said a little bit about that, dates from when she's in prison. This is the whole title, again, titles of things. Women's Speaking, Justified, Proved, and Allowed of by the Scriptures. And it's a long theological defence of women's preaching, teaching, and religious leadership on an equal basis with men. That was something that she and her fellow Quakers, and also members of some other radical groups even from before Quakers, you've got Baptists certainly in the 1640s, had been practicing. So it's kind of an explanation of what's going on rather than a proposal to change anything. It's not like, oh, we've got this all-male club and I'm going to ask nicely if the women can join it. It's like, well, we're doing this is happening. I'm just going to explain to you how that is so and how that can be the case. And it's become necessary because we are in a context in which basically religious innovation and creativity is being much more suppressed, right? And anything that looks a bit weird is under much more critical scrutiny, including and especially women preaching. But I actually love the fact that it's an explanation of what's going on rather than a proposal to change anything, because she knows women can preach the gospel because they're doing it. And so she also assumes, therefore, that it can't be contrary to the Bible. And of course, knowing her Bible pretty well, she doesn't have a problem finding not just a long, very, very, very long list of examples of women preaching, and it not being a problem, but also a clear and consistent theology, an account of women's dignity and equal worth and centrality to the purposes of God. It's quite a fun text to read, because the way I always feel it goes is she first sort of sets out her argument step by step. You start with creation, and you start with women and men being in the image of God. Then you move forward, and you talk about the way that she reads Genesis, the first promise of Christ is given to a woman, so Eve has a special kind of status. And then you have women as prophets, or women as disciples, or women as the first preachers of the resurrection, and the Spirit poured out on men and women, and the church is a woman, and so on. So she does that all step by step, and then she just gets a bit annoyed and lets rip. So for example, she quotes the Magnificat, the Song of Mary, one you're familiar with, my soul does magnify the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Saviour, this one, which is part of, then and now is a core part of church liturgies, right? People are saying this every day. And Margaret writes, well, are you not here beholding to the woman for her sermon to use her words to put in your common prayer, right? So you've taken it for your churches, and yet you forbid women speaking. You will make a trade of women's words to get money by, and take texts and preach sermons upon women's words and still cry out, women must not speak, women must be silent. It's getting frustrating. You're actually exploiting the resources, exploiting the work of women and not acknowledging what they're doing. There were several Quaker defences of women's preaching and leadership from these early decades, including George Fox writes some quite influential ones as well. This one's the biggest and kind of the most influential at the time and since. And to be honest, in all the intervening centuries of debate about women's status and authority in Christianity, at least in Protestant churches, there aren't a huge number of arguments that aren't already covered in Women Speaking Justified, 1666, which is either impressive or depressing, depending how you look on it, right? Anyway, we should get to the end of the story. Let's get towards the end of the story. I feel like I've spent a lot of time on the early bits, a little on the late. We can talk more later about all of the interesting things that happen after Margaret gets out of prison. So she's released from prison. She gets her house and her land back. There's a really complicated to-do about that because they've been forfeited to the crown and then claimed back by her son, who's not a Quaker, and then she ends up being able to live there. And a year or so later, she marries George Fox. They had more than 20 years of marriage before his death, and they spent hardly any time in the same place, because basically he's mostly travelling or in prison. She's mostly travelling or in prison. This goes to prison again for a little bit later. At his request, they make a prenuptial agreement that he won't have any control over her money, which was... there's all sorts of interesting power dynamics going on there, but that's partly about recognising that she's older than him, she's higher social status, but he's not claiming what, or she's not letting him claim the kind of control that a husband would expect to have. So there you are. Both of them live to see the toleration, like the end of persecution of Quakers in the 1680s. It's a relatively short, though quite intense period during which there's significant persecution of Quakers, and they both live through it. And Margaret even lives long enough to see the first introduction, largely because of Quaker interventions, including some higher status Quakers like William Penn and so on, the first introduction of legal provision for those who have a religious objection to swearing an oath. Although I was looking this up and I found out that Quakers in Lancashire didn't like, they were a bit more strict about it. They thought that the alternative they'd been given still looked a bit too much like an oath. So they held out, Quakers in Lancashire were very, very, very principled. And they held out for something more clearly not anything to do with God and nothing to do with swearing. But still got the legal provision. So Margaret is seeing that during you have a whole period where they're building the organisation, they're still writing, still doing the correspondence, still doing the support for these networks. She's still writing her open letters, her epistles in her late 80s. I'm particularly fond of one from when she was about 85, when she's advising fellow Quakers against bringing in too many rules or expectations about what a good Quaker and hence a good Christian should look like. She says, quote unquote, it's a dangerous thing to lead young friends, i.e. Quakers, much into the observance of outward things which may be easily done, for they can soon get into an outward garb to be all alike outwardly, but that will not make them true Christians. In other words, I find this important as a parent and educator, actually. There's something about how following the crowd and acting a part, like, wearing the stuff you're meant to wear and going along with what all the others are doing, is always going to be a really big human temptation. And the thing is, she's not blaming young people for wanting to conform or comply, or maybe they're virtue signaling, maybe she thinks they're virtue signaling, I don't know. But anyway, to do something because all the others are doing it, because that's easy. She's not blaming the young people for that, but she's saying that the teachers and the leaders have a responsibility not to play into it. We're supposed to be speaking to the light in people's consciences and encouraging them to seek truth, rather than placing burdens on them about how they are to perform and appear. And this is the sort of matriarch of the movement, if you like, in her late 80s, trying to say how are we going to keep this thing going, and resisting the temptation to say, well, we basically need a new power structure, if you like, a new official set of rules that everybody's got to follow. And that last letter, in the main that's the last one that's available in the main early anthology of Margaret's work, the things that were compiled after her death. So that's the first, the Quakers that put it together sort of saw that as her last a testament. It's a dangerous thing to lead folks much into the observance of outward things. And perhaps I'm going to take that as my place to end, because I think it's a good place to end. I care about Margaret Fell, as you've probably picked up, for a lot of reasons. But perhaps most because I find her voice empowering. And not just as some sort of example to follow, and not just because I agree with what she says, because I don't always, right? You're not going to. But because she wants everyone to take truth really seriously, seek it for themselves, have the freedom of conscience to do so, and that's the other thing about her work, and to look after each other while they're doing so, to seek truth in community, and to uphold and empower one another. And, if only for those reasons, it seems to me that she is someone whom a university does well to commemorate. So I'm delighted to have been able to do this lecture in a Margaret Fell lecture theatre. Thank you all.